can't be certain.
Are we heading to the polls?
Because no one's actually saying it. This time it feels different.
Someone involved said, look, the thing is, well, what if he hadn't been brave enough to do it in the rain, he'd have got slated for not being brave enough to do it in the rain.
There were proper moments of, what? Really?
Actually, maybe they weren't quite as ready as they thought they were.
He wasn't going to be a candidate. He wasn't the leader of Reform. And then...
I've changed my mind.
You couldn't have scripted a worse set of events for a leader on the right during an election campaign.
Hello, Laura. As you start your tea, or is that eggnog or mulled wine?
It's coffee. It's white coffee. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Good. Hello.
Hi, Christmassy.
Hi, Christmassy.
And hello, Chris.
Hi.
Right, I thought we'd do a little trip down memory lane.
Ooh,
Although, is the election a lane? Or is it like a sort of like
six-lane highway?
Super highway.
Like a ski slalom. But first of all, we've done some statistical number crunching about our own podcast. So we rebranded as Election Cast, as we do quite regularly over the last 10 years.
How unusually self-indulgent.
Yeah, we did 2,565 minutes of Election Cast.
Good God.
Everyone, absolutely delightful.
You say that though, but
Yeah.
360 of those minutes were the 6-hour-long live episode I did on BBC Sounds the day before. And that is a total of 42.75 hours. How many episodes do you think that was?
Sorry, my mind was already spinning.
You were wandering down memory lane. You're already on memory lane.
My mind had cantered off into a different field. How many?
66 episodes between the 22nd of May and the 8th of July.
There you go. That's a lot.
And I remember every single one, which is good because we're now going to recap some of the most important bits. Do we want to do a little sort of pre-election, like sort of just lay the ground? And I always find it quite hard to like get myself back into the mindset of what was happening before kind of big seismic events that have happened since. But what are your sort of thoughts about the phony pre-election period?
Once upon a time, there was a man called Boris Johnson. Look, I think
we're not going that far back.
We were in a grinding status quo for a long time when it was pretty clear that the Tories believed they were going to lose the election. Labour believed they were going to win the election, although they maybe emotionally didn't quite allow themselves to believe it in a different way. But that was the status quo. The Tories had been scrapping with each other, having a terrible time for years and years. Labour had been grinding towards a victory, and we were in that status quo for a long time, basically just about all of sort of 2023 and
and we were
24.
So two things I remember two particular moments in that first 6 months of this year around the election. Firstly was a trip to Bristol that I did on pretty much the first working day in January the 3rd or 4th or something like that. It was pouring with rain. We were with Keir Starmer, and he was doing the kind of, New Year speech, but New Year in an election year speech. And then was doing some interviews afterwards. And meanwhile, somewhere else in the country, Rishi Sunak was doing something, but a bit more low-key, because his main start of the year speech was somewhere else on a different day. And he was talking to a regional ITV reporter, as often happens, and they do a few questions on a few different things. And in answer to, I think, the third or fourth question, out popped this line about how the election will be in the second half of the year. And this was
except it was more secondhand than that, because he said, my working assumption is that it will be.
Exactly. And this was done to a regional ITV reporter midway through an interview. It wasn't live. We were standing in this manufacturing site. I was about to say the Prime Minister. He wasn't the Prime Minister at the time. The Labour leader was doing these round of interviews with folk like me and Robert Pesson and others, when this news started circulating second-hand. Oh, what's the Prime Minister said, and what's the exact wording, and can we get hold of the tape? And basically, I had to do a chunk of my interview with Keir Starmer again in order to get a reaction to this thing about the timings. But then we were already in, as Laura said, into this period where folk like us were using the E word all the time, but with a question mark afterward, where it would be perfectly reasonable for newscasters and others to think, yeah, we know it's coming up fairly soon, but just come back and tell us when it's actually on. And of course, we didn't know. And that became the prism through which we were looking at politics for the next 5 months until we got that point in of Rishi Sunak calling it.
And we've had quite a few books, loads of conversations with people. What do you think swung it for number 10 about pushing the button for the 4th of July?
I think they believed that nothing was going to get any better at the end.
Yeah.
And also,
But there was a dispute within Rishi's
Oh
team.
yeah, oh, absolutely.
Rishi
And the
Sunak.
campaign director, Isaac Levido, who was the guy who was, sort of designed the 2019 victory to a great extent, he was against it, and that wasn't a secret. But I think they didn't think it was going to get any better. And I remember a particular conversation with someone who worked in the Treasury, and they sat and said, nothing is going to get better. People haven't realised how bad the books are. This was a Conservative source. And also we're going to have to pay for all sorts of things that nobody's counting in the infected blood compensation. What's happened this week? The government's had to start paying that out, and that's more than £10 billion. The Horizon post office scandal, they're going to have to. Yeah, but they talked specifically about there was going to be nothing to offer the Conservative Party any hope of doing tax cuts, which they might have wanted to offer in an autumn election. However, it's still disputed, and it's one of the great sliding doors moments. If they'd hung on till the autumn, inflation went down, all sorts of things might have looked different. But it was so broken, it was so broken. And when we were thinking about moments of the year, and this goes into the campaign, but it just stuck in my mind because it was just a flavour of how broken everything was. Somebody passed me a recording of a Home Office minister describing the Rwanda policy, flagship policy, as being crap. Right? That is how you had government ministers going around. Obviously, they hadn't chosen to put that into the public domain, but it was just so broken.
Yes.
And on air we sat and did, doing our job. We played it to the Home Secretary, who was then James Cleverly, and he had to sort of defend it and say, well, actually he's saying that the policy's crap, but it's not really crap because it's the best policy we've got, and just tying himself in knots. You just think, wow, that it has come to this. It was so broken. So whenever it was going to be, I think it was, they were fighting the inevitable all along, whenever the date might have been.
And then we'd already had a couple of sort of false alarms around a potential moment where it looked like there might be a head of steam building towards the Prime Minister.
Including once on a Friday sort of lunchtime, which would have been slightly weird.
Yeah, saying, it was all going to happen. And then on the day itself, and most of those, pretty much all of those previous occasions, I was able to make a few calls and be fairly confident fairly quickly it wasn't happening yet. Yet being the operative word. But when you're trying to find out, is it going to happen today or on Monday or whatever? And then came that particular day where the night before, and it's a classic thing, it's when people are not picking up phones. And the wider government system, people saying to me, something's going on at the centre. And this was civil servants saying this, as well as special advisors and others. They're not picking up. Something's going weird. They're up to something. And there was only one something they could really be up to, realistically, given where we were in the electoral cycle and all the stuff about them kind of running out of steam and things going wrong and all the rest of it. And that carried on that evening. Morning after, still that wall of silence. And then I was thinking, what do you do with this? Do you go because I'm so conscious doing the job I do of not being the emperor with no clothes. Whoa, something's happening, maybe, and then actually it doesn't. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to. I went on the Stowe programme and said, I can't be certain because no one's actually saying it, but this time it feels different, and I reckon it might be happening today.
And people listening to this might be quite surprised that there were quite senior people in the government and the machine who didn't know.
Yeah.
And actually that became significant in the early stages because there were quite a few Conservatives going, hang on, I don't agree with this timing, and actually, and people who knew they were going to be out of a job going, hang on, I don't have time to sort out my life. Like, why has he done this?
No, for sure. And because what had happened as well is you'd passed the date when they might conceivably have had an election in May. So the sort of working assumption, to use Rishi Sunak's phrase, was that if they were going to do spring, they'd do in May because there are a load of elections then anyway. But they'd passed the deadline for doing that. And it's a moment though when what is happening is it's not about the government machine, it's about the party machine. So news had reached my ears from a party person saying, I'm sure it's happening, and I think it's going to be the first week of July. And I was like, July? What are you on about? That nobody has talked about July. Where is the logic for July? Not least because good Scottish people have already gone on holiday, right? Which, as you know, I was concerned about. There had been no smart money on July.
It'd all been on
November, October, or May. And but just to go back to your question about, it's weird that senior people in the government machine don't know what's going on. These are party decisions. And that's really when you get into an election, you're moving away. This is when the parties fight it out. And it's interesting, Labour for a long time, they'd been convinced there was going to be a spring election. Absolutely convinced.
So much so that about 10 days before Rishi Sunak called the election, we went to a Labour event in Thurrock in Essex.
Was this the six first steps?
Yeah, which oozed election launch, because you know, when you go to as many events as we do, you can see the ones that are relatively hastily arranged, relatively cheaply rented, and then you can see the ones where they've thrown money at it.
That's what they'd planned it as, though. It wasn't. That's what they'd planned it as, expecting it was going to be that day.
Completely.
So they were like,
well,
let's go ahead and do it because why not?
Because you had all the classics. Like it was like the audience was in the round, so Keir Starmer was surrounded by people. There was a parade of Labour supporters with various heartfelt stories.
The videos, you know, the lighting, the things that take time and money and focus and attention. And they ploughed on with it. You know, that was that.
Although I do remember that day, it's like, oh, this is a group of people that love a bullet-pointed list to explain what they're doing.
Don't they just?
That maybe isn't necessarily the best way of conveying a powerful message to the general population. It might be quite a good way of organising yourself and organising a potential government, but not necessarily convincing people that you've got a really obvious plan. Then there's the moment itself where Rishi Sunak presses the go button and he's in Downing Street in an image that's now become infamous of him just getting totally soaked in the rain and chatting to somebody who is very involved in that. They said the biggest reason that happened was because the last time he'd done one of those big street moments was after George Galloway had won that by-election, and he wanted to do a big thing about the dangers of extremism. And it had rained during that, but it was in the dark. And so they'd all got into their minds, oh, the PM can go out, get rained on, and actually it doesn't really show up on TV. Unfortunately, during the day, it does.
Yeah.
And it really, 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 really did. But I remember on that day, and someone involved said, look, the thing is, well, what if he hadn't been brave enough to do it in the rain, he'd got slated for not being brave enough to do it in the rain. Or if we'd put a brolly on him, we would have taken the mick for him having a brolly. I mean, and it did look absolutely.
And the thing is, it was proper. It was proper.
And you know, because you were there.
Well, I was there.
Better.
Yeah, and all of our.
You were in the street for longer.
So we'd spent a bit of the earlier in the day starting to think about assembling all of our kit to go out on the road for 6 weeks, and various members of the team say, we must make sure we've got spares and all the rest of it. We went through all of our kit in the first afternoon, because there's one thing electronic kit really does not like, and that is rain. And everything was wrecked. And we were absolutely soaked. And the thing is, it tilted from
underwear.
It was like a monsoon.
Yeah.
Oh no! Look, I just have to say, for the record, I never wanted to know that, and I didn't want to be reminded of it today. Thanks very much.
Sorry, but it's true. I've lost my train of thought now entirely.
Good, let's move on.
But yeah, it was. The thing is, it was just beyond. It was absurd levels of rain. That was the thing. It was,
but actually not necessarily at the start of this. So you can understand why somebody might take the gamble and be like, "Oh, we can get through it." It was actually.
But here's another thing, and it's a thing about Rishi Sunak's sort of one of his, and you know, he had many strengths, his backers would say, but one of his flaws or difficulties as a politician was improvising. So a different politician in a downpour would have been able to crack a gag, refer to it somehow, say something sort of self-deprecating.
Wrap it up quicker or whatever.
Right, and he just was sticking to the script, not even saying, I wouldn't have done it today if I'd known, right? And then that's how you charm people. You make a joke. And good, you know, as we were saying, actually, I think I was saying to Paddy a couple of weeks ago, and it's a great line from somebody in one of the parties said, the thing is, I'm not sure that Keir is the good politician who can put your taxes up with a smile and make you feel good. And and it's the same actually of Sunak and Starmer have a lot in common actually.
Yeah, they do.
A lot in common. And how you turn some really sort of quicksilverish politicians can turn moments of real challenge actually into a win for them. And he could have won a lot
years and years ago, Tony Blair as Prime Minister, I think it was the CBI, a conference centre in Islington in North London, and there was a bit of a protest. I think it was an environmental
protest. It was about
protest.
nuclear power.
Yeah, something like that. And it was completely chaotic.
Yeah.
Do you do the speech? He ends up on some sort of soapbox or standing on a chair or whatever, but managed to kind of pull off and keep the audience with him in a moment of total kind of shambles and chaos. And I guess those moments of improvisation, some political leaders can rise to that, and others not.
And that idea of nimbleness actually takes us to the first kind of big news story of the campaign, which is what would Labour do about Diane Abbott, which lasted for 3 or 4 days.
It did, and they did not look like they were in control of their narrative. They were having a lot of internal ructions about it, and it looked very, very messy.
And so the backstory to this is that Diane Abbott had been suspended as a Labour MP back in April 2023 because of some comments she'd made to The Guardian about how Jewish, Irish and traveller people don't face racism all of their lives. She then withdrew their remarks and she was the subject of a big investigation, and she was allowed back into the Labour Parliamentary Party, but there was lots of speculation that she would be blocked from being a candidate at the election for Labour, or maybe even that she was going to sort of retire gracefully, but that all kind of blew up and it ended up in a multi-day row about wouldn't she be allowed to stand.
So Keir Starmer had taken control and grip of the Labour Party by, his supporters would say, marvellously, ruthlessly rooting out the left, taking control of the party machine, absolutely cracking down on anti-Semitism, but it was a lot about anti-Semitism and getting rid of that, but it was also about grabbing control of the levers of the party. That in the heat of the first week of the election campaign, they found themselves in a massive dilemma over what to do with one of the iconic veterans of the Labour left, a black female MP who is a household name, and not many politicians are household names. That was shambolic. And they didn't have control of the briefing. They weren't really in charge of everything that was happening. And I just thought, God, they've been preparing for this for a long time. But it stuck out to me when I was thinking about the campaign, because it showed you that actually maybe they weren't quite as ready as they thought they were. And that's been the theme of their first 6 months in government. So when I was thinking back to it, it's like, actually, that was just a little pebble in the pond. That yes, this machine is slick. They are ready. They've worked damn hard. They say, and I'm sure people were saying the same thing to you, Chris. I remember talking to people who are now cabinet ministers saying, "Oh, you won't believe the amount of preparation we've done. It's amazing. Sue's made us doing all the," but also the programme of work for government. And now they've arrived. It's much more common to have a minister saying, "Well," and their opponents saying, and including some government officials saying, "I don't really think they've got that much of a plan."
Well, we're now sort of like messing with the timeline a bit, but have we got to the bottom of whether Labour were prepared enough for government? And I know it's all tied up with personnel issues and personalities as well, and maybe it's an impossible thing to get to the bottom of.
So the thing that I was struck by, save for that, and it was a big moment, the whole Diane Abbott kind of wobble that they had. And this has become something of a cliche, really, in the last 6 months. But the surprise election caused by the Conservatives played out looking like more of a surprise to the Conservatives than it did to Labour. And Labour, on the whole, particularly in terms of what they had prepared to do, as opposed to dealing with things that came at them and took them by surprise, they were really prepared for their campaign, and they knew what they wanted to do, and they knew the message that they wanted to prosecute. But they were also, and this gets into the sort of psychology of the party, really, they were obsessed in those 6 months before about not giving an impression that they were measuring up the curtains, that they took anything for granted. They were very aware of their own history, which is their capacity to lose elections, including ones that many people think they're going to win. And yet we were being told at the time, yes, but, and this reflects what you were saying, we've got Sue Gray, she worked in government for years, she's focused on the plans for government, etc., etc. And yet what we've seen since then, and it's a real contrast because so much of their campaign was so well prepared and pretty slick, really.
And Starmer did say multiple times we're ready to govern on day one.
Ground running.
Yeah, and yet they've sort of hit the ground stumbling.
Yeah.
And with real concern privately from ministers at a very senior level that kind of narrative that's built up is an accurate one. That is the reality of what's happened.
I think that's what we've seen, right?
Yeah, and a real worry from them that if they don't turn that round pretty quickly, a year will have gone by where they perhaps not made the most of what they could have done.
And do you know what? While we're mucking around with the timeline, as Dr. Strange is producing this episode of Newscast, that's
no way to talk about the team through the glass. It's outrageous. Just for the record, I will always defend your interests over, my colleagues here.
You and I onto a timeline.
I know, good luck with that.
I'm messing with it. I'm like, well, what timeline? What? What is time?
I'm just looking forward to May of next year.
But just in terms of tweaking the timeline again. Back to the day the election was called. Actually, Labour Labour had been tipped off because of movements in the betting market, which then became a massive story at the end of the election campaign because of some revelations.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that whole twist in the campaign was astonishing, really. The tip-offs that that I had and Pippa Crerar of The Guardian had, and certainly the ones that I got, there were proper moments of, what? Really?
That people in the Tory inner circle had been betting on the date of the election.
Yeah, not just them. So the first tip-off I had related to a particular, to those who were close protection officers of the Prime Minister, police officers. And that we quickly managed to stand up, to use the sort of journalistic phrase, because the Metropolitan Police acknowledged that was happening. And then I had a tip-off about a parliamentary candidate who happened to work in Conservative HQ, and we chased that down and did all of our checking, and we broadcast that, and then we broadcast that first on the 10 o'clock news the night before, having done the police story at 6 o'clock, and then I was on my way home at about gone midnight, one of those nights, and someone texted me and said, "Do you know who she's married to?" And I said no, because to be honest, I'd not heard of her until 5 hours before. So the family tree was certainly news to me. And they said, "Oh, well, she's married to the
director of campaigns."
The director of campaigns. Blimey, right? Well, there's another strand, and also that, and so off we went again.
Yeah,
and then you and I were on the phone the morning after.
And then God, that was
and sort of on it, and it was extraordinary. And seeing the Prime Minister as was, seeing Rishi Sunak at the time, because obviously we're chasing him and Keir Starmer and Ed Davey and John Swinney and all the others around the country. Just that sense of, yet from his perspective, on a human level, from his perspective, yet more air going out of the balloon of this thing that any political leader in that moment would find that sort of thing off the scale irritating.
Yeah.
But given his character and his sense of propriety and all the rest of it, just a punch in the guts.
It was, another punch in the guts after the previous punch in the guts, which was the criticism he got for leaving D-Day, so that we got that picture of Lord Cameron, the then Foreign Secretary, hanging out with the German Chancellor, the French President, and the US.
And you know what? I was at a do about a week ago and was sitting next to a senior Conservative who was still 6 months on venting about that, and what in their view, massive own goal it was, and in the view of this person, the direct impact they reckoned it had in particular seats from the election.
For sure. I mean, it was a dream for the Labour Party and the absolute nightmare. I mean, but the betting thing, the D-Day thing, the rain, you couldn't have scripted a worse set of events for a leader on the right during an election campaign. I mean, you just really couldn't, because they all saw they all kind of talked to a lack of dignity, right? Yeah, and it's just, when you're thinking about Sunak's character, he's not a sort of a joker, as some might be like, oh, well, everyone had a little bit of a flutter, ha, 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 and people go, well, that's a bit grim, but never mind, move on. He wasn't somebody who'd be able to come out and say, well, D-Day, well, I had important bit, I was there and I paid my respects and we did this, that and the other. And all of those things were terrible political accidents that just all looked awful.
And in policy
really
terms,
awful.
I mean, their signature policy, the Conservatives, was the return of national service, which was actually not even that. And that's an interesting lesson in how, in an election campaign, something can get lots of attention and everyone's talking about it and everyone has an opinion about it. And it's very easily communicable, but doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually achieving anything with it.
No, although they did manage with the campaign at that, and they grabbed the conch, if you like, for a couple of days over that policy. And I remember getting briefed on that, thinking, well, that'll get people talking. And it did. And you thought, because there was a view in a lot of senior Conservatives, actually, that Starmer was still not that good. And they probably weren't going to be able to beat him. That would have looked completely ludicrous, but they didn't actually have to have the kind of complete pasting that some of the more outlandish polls were suggesting. And indeed, that the result bit was a pasting, even though it wasn't a kind of completely outlandish pasting that some of the crackers end of the polling industry were suggesting. Polling, of course, can be very useful, but the ranges and the kind of levels of polling that we were seeing were sort of, just wild.
Yeah.
But actually, those sort of unforced errors just meant that idea that they might not actually take on that much water. I wasn't even wanting to make a pun then. They just lost it.
But you get the ebbs and flows as well. So it's interesting. This conversation just starts the memory sort of jolting through the highways and byways of the campaign.
I'm glad you knew what the format was going to be in advance.
Yeah. Because
I thought we were only doing another 1 minute of this election.
Because whilst Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives had these really kind of grim moments from their perspective, I think that the national service thing got people talking. The other moment, that first TV debate, the ITV debate in Salford that Julie Etchingham hosted, Rishi Sunak he arguably won that night. He really
dropped the ball on tax.
Yeah, exactly.
So basically, like, Rishi Sunak was making all these claims that Labour would put up everyone's taxes by £2,000 over the course of a parliament, and it took Keir Starmer a long time,
about an hour and a half,
to rebut that.
It was a long time. Yeah.
Even like a kind of amateur armchair politician knows that the first rule is you have to fight back and not let that dominate.
Yeah. And, you know, I speak to Conservatives now who say, well, that figure was an underestimate. Because there was a huge argument in the days afterwards around the veracity of that number and how that number had been arrived at.
Yeah.
But there was also a fair bit of soul-searching within the Labour campaign about the perceived lack of sharpness from Keir Starmer that night in dealing with something that had come at him. And it took him rather a long time. I said 2 hours a minute ago. It had been about 45 minutes, wasn't it? It was an hour. Maybe
it wasn't like the length of like a Lord of the Rings film, although it did feel like.
But it took him most of that programme to get to the point where he was willing to try and hose it down.
Are we all kicking ourselves that we didn't specifically ask Labour ministers whether they were planning to put up employers' national insurance?
Well, the Tories had spotted it. So Laura Trott, who was then as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I mean, I was thinking about that as well, because we had Reeves on and she did say, and it was a sort of story out of our interview, and she said, we will not put up income tax and we will not put up... And of course, you think, oh, well, should have asked her about that more specific thing. But, you know, you're dealing with what you're dealing with, and an interview's not very interesting if you go down the checklist of every
I didn't mean to beat you up about not asking.
No, but it's a good question, and it's a good question, and I think also what they've said in that is they'd have stuck to their formula, which is we are not going to put taxes up on working people. That was their formula. That's still their formula, and then actually it's now modulated into we're not putting taxes on payslips.
Yes.
Because like if you get a payslip from and
it took them a little while to come up with that formulation to get around the fact that they looked like they maybe were breaching a manifesto.
But what part of the election dynamic was that whoever wins, they're going to have to do really horrible things in terms of pressures on public spending, and they're going to have to raise taxes somehow, and that was very clear. And we did all wang on about that endlessly.
Back to the psychology though of Labour and their attitude pre-election, given their nervousness about their electoral performance and particularly their economic credibility, that, you know, Rachel Reeves as Shadow Chancellor could have decided, and Keir Starmer could have decided pre-election to oppose those cuts in employee national insurance that the Conservatives had and make an argument about it's not sustainable given the state of the public finances, blah, blah, blah. But didn't feel they had the political space or the courage or willingness at that point to do that, with an election coming and what would have been attacks from their opponents about typical old Labour bunging up your taxes, etc., etc.
Although I do remember very clearly sitting in that seat that you're sitting in now, Laura, when we did that 6-hour-long marathon newscast the day before the election day, and Liz Kendall, who's now the Work and Pension Secretary, was on down the line, and I said to Liz Kendall, can you promise me that Rachel Reeves, kind of about a month after she's become Chancellor, will not come to Parliament and say, I've opened the books, there's loads of things that are really bad in there that I didn't know about, we're going to have to change our plans. And Liz Kendall said, I can guarantee you that will not happen.
Did she?
I was like, really? Because that normally happens after elections. She's like, no, we've got the Office of Budget Responsibility now that lays it all out. It's all very clear. Rachel Reeves will not do that. And then what happened? Rachel Reeves did exactly that.
And I think also it's both true and untrue that there were things that you couldn't possibly have imagined, nasties lurking. So, and if you talk to people in government who are not political about that, they sort of say, well, it's sort of fair that, yes, you can only understand how difficult things are once you're on the inside. It is also grade A nonsense to suggest that nobody knew that there were going to have to be very difficult decisions about probably raising taxes or cutting loads of public spending or trying to do both in a rather uncomfortable way.
And we tried to reflect that. And
we reported it all the way through.
Yeah. Paul Johnson of the Institute of Fiscal Studies was out about making those arguments as well.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage.
Yes.
So he did a bit of a U-turn because he wasn't going to be a candidate. He wasn't the leader of Reform, and then within a couple of days, he was a candidate for a constituency and he was the new leader of Reform.
Are you suggesting that Nigel Farage sometimes dances around what his plans might be until he can decide what the best outcome might be for himself?
And makes news at every stage as well.
Yeah, exactly. Of course he was. And actually, though, that's another reason why some Tories think Sunak should have waited, because if he waited till the autumn, Farage might have been over in Trump world, enjoying himself, hanging around Mar-a-Lago, and then, however, sliding doors, who knows. But yeah, Nigel Farage and Reform had an absolutely stonking election. They came second in, I think, nearly 100 seats. They managed to get some MPs. Farage's 7th attempt or 8th attempt,
I think.
To actually get his bum on the green benches managed. And and I think not necessarily because of using the sort of pulpit they've got in Parliament. It feels in a way they're doing clever politics outside Parliament. They're doing really professionalising, building, campaigning around the country. And he had a great election. And I think 2025 is going to be very interesting to see how Reform does, because they have successfully tapped into that mood in the country that politicians are very aware of and Labour is very worried about, is that not just the feeling that, nothing really works, but also that nothing really works and nobody who's in charge actually has got any idea how to solve the problems.
And I hadn't quite clocked this until a few weeks ago, which is that for the first few months, Reform were a presence in Parliament because of the things that they said and the issues that they raised and the behaviour of some of their MPs. But they didn't really feel like a sort of the big structural presence in British politics that the election results suggested. But then in the last few weeks of 2024, that changed and everyone started talking about actually the impact. And it's because people are starting to think about the next set of elections, whether it's local authorities in England or the Welsh Assembly.
Yeah, and they're working very hard in Wales.
We're really hard in Wales. They're working really hard at building the kind of not sexy but really important structures that a party needs if it's gonna do well, which is the operation on the ground in lots of different parts of the country. They're putting a huge amount of attention and having real success in terms of social media. Nigel Farage on TikTok, so talking to an audience that you might not imagine would be their kind of core audience, young men in particular. They're reaching with
doing his video about the London hotel that didn't have any full fat milk.
Oh yes,
example.
yes.
But it's an interesting thing, though. I remember we did a load of focus groups in the year. We did that Britain in a Room thing. We had, and the Reform voters group were fascinating, and they weren't people who you'd have put in any one particular political box. So when we used to talk about, UKIP and then the Brexit Party, this sort of, and the ancestors of the Reform Party, they were always either sort of driven by immigration or dislike of Brussels and the European Union sort of mega structure and that kind of flank of politics. Basically, it was a sort of a right-wing strand. Reform is much more complicated than that.
It really is, yeah.
And it's much more about sort of emotion and sentiment. And I think, as I say, the 2025, they're going to have a very interesting year. And the only person probably who enjoyed the election campaign more than that was Ed Davey.
Yes,
yes.
Paddleboarder extraordinaire.
Watery fun,
Yes.
Ed Davey, theme park master. So, they had a great time. And the Lib Dems, I mean, they fought incredibly good campaigns on the ground for a long time. They were laser targeted on seats that they thought they could win. Candidates had to really work hard to get central resources. They were very canny about where they were putting their resources. In towns that had posh bakeries. And they're now once again the third party in Parliament. And so that was we shouldn't forget about that part of the election and the massive demise of the SNP. So they did a big kind of switcheroo and all sorts of very interesting things.
I mean, the Lib Dems played a blinder as a campaign to turn, a party that for so long has railed against the first past the post system because it was so often something that did them an injustice. This time it was Reform who ended up with a massive number of votes versus a very small number of seats. To turn those stunts, because those stunts were very visual and shareable on social media and all the rest of it, they were also very geographically focused.
Yeah, of course.
So you knew that, he's at that place down the road where you can go, zip down a water slide or whatever.
And their big thing was about the sewage problem, and so the paddleboard falling in was a perfect distillation of that being their issue.
Yeah, and sort of professionalising the embarrassing dad routine, but then because he could talk very passionately and very authentically about his own personal experience as far as looking after his disabled son is concerned and the loss of his parents when he was young, he couldn't be caricatured as a sort of middle class bloke having a whale of a time when lots of people are struggling, because he could talk very authentically about his own family struggles. So combining those two things with the stunts and then that geographical focus was an extraordinary outcome from them. The challenge, though, for them, and I've been struck by this in the last 6 months, is how you turn 70-odd MPs into influence. So they've massively expanded their parliamentary footprint, but they're now in a parliament with a Labour government with a colossal majority, and then a noisy argument involving reform, and then the Conservatives trying to work out what they do given reform and given where they find themselves in Parliament. And I think the challenge for the Lib Dems now is, how do you turn that into influence?
Well, and the same issue, but on a much smaller scale for the Greens.
Yeah,
who got 4 MPs, so quadrupling their number of MPs from the previous parliament. But that then maybe reveals more about divisions within the Greens than it does about what the Greens can do to influence everyone else.
And it's what do you do with it now, right? You've got there. What do you do with it now? And it's interesting. They did well in town and country, and they ran different campaigns in different places. And of course, successful political parties always run different campaigns in different places. Even though, of course, we endlessly talk about their national message and the big thing, but politicians who do well are flexible and nimble, and they do run differently in different places. And the Greens in Suffolk were running different focuses to the Greens in Bristol, and what they do with it now will be really interesting to see. And 2025 is going to be, I think it might be quite a wild ride. But without question, the massive headline from the election, beyond all the different strands we've talked about, is just that we have, after 14 years of one lot, another tribe are in charge, and they absolutely smashed the Tories. They've got a historically incredible, thumping, massive majority, significantly chunkier than Boris Johnson's huge majority in 2019. And that is a huge moment of history that every newscaster will remember.
Well, there just haven't been that many Labour prime ministers who've been elected.
Correct. Correct. And there haven't been that many governments ever with such a big majority. And it doesn't feel like it, which is the interesting observation for the first 6 months.
No, quite. It feels more competitive. Yeah. The conversation feels more competitive than the numbers. Labour can win any vote they want and win it comfortably. Even with significant, massive rebellions, they could still win. The key thing, and we just touched on this earlier, and this will be it's central to the political story of 2025, is can they demonstrate a sense of delivery, or does there become a growing sense that neither of the big Westminster parties are, for whatever reason, sufficiently equipped to deliver a sense of lives getting better for significant numbers of people? Governing in the 2020s is proving pretty tricky, whatever your political colour. Can a government with a really big majority actually do stuff that people think, okay, that things are happening, or not?
And it was just, this is the cheesy Christmas bit, it was just such a privilege being able to sort of sit and think and read and listen and then talk about it every day with you guys. It's just amazing. It's amazing. Do you want to end on some momentous moments? Pick a momentous moment. From either the campaign or election night, or...
the two things actually we've touched on already. The Diane Abbott thing I thought was fascinating. The Rwanda's crap moment was just a kind of the moment you go, this is really, really broken and bad. But the moment that I think, when we said that Labour had won, when you have enough in to know that Labour are going to win. I can't remember what time that was, or the exit poll. An exit poll, that's an exciting thing to do.
I remember.
That's just also selfishly. Reading out the exit polls if you do our kind of job,
that's kind of
exactly. That's kind of quite exciting, and you're standing there and you're going, and your heart rate's going.
And I remember.
The poll suggests and I was, I think I said before, I practiced all the different versions when I was in the shower.
Beautiful acoustics.
And the exit poll's predicting a SNP landslide. No, that one's probably not going to happen.
Everyone was getting wet at some point in the night.
I remember sort of, because obviously prior to that moment where Clive and Laura were reading out the exit poll result, and Nick and Rachel were doing it on the radio and all the rest of it. Obviously, we're told the numbers just before, and just being sat there, I think I was sat next to you,
that's good.
with a pad, biro and a grid, and you're thinking, okay, and then immediately I'm thinking, right, well, what does that mean for what I'm going to be saying in 10 minutes? 10 minutes time. And that's a privilege, real privilege.
Being in that room is amazing. And I may or may not have told people to shut up and stop talking about whatever they.
I do remember. I admire.
Having bandinage, I was like, shh.
I did remember that.
They're working here.
I was like, I didn't even say anything, Laura.
I was going to use.
No, I know it wasn't.
My moment's very boring compared to that, but it was a sort of on-air one, and it was when Chris, you and I were recording an episode of Newscast on a Friday tea time, and then we got the news that Michael Gove wasn't standing as a candidate. And now it's pretty obvious he probably wouldn't, because why would you, after all those years in office, and then want to be in opposition and blah, blah. But for me, it was just like, right, it's that old cliche of the end of an era. That was like, that was the moment where you're like, this is that chapter, which was basically been my whole political journalist life, as Michael Gove has been there, was ending.
And 6 months later, he was handing out prizes to politicians at the Spectator Awards,
including newcomer of the year,
Christmas, and then interviewing Kemi Badenoch for the magazine he now edits.
Whoever said that Westminster is a revolving door? People are all too connected.
Well, we're not heading for a revolving door. We're heading for the exit door, because that's it for this episode of Newscast, where we've been looking back at the 2024 general election. And the best thing is that you were there with us the whole way through. So thanks for reminiscing with us too. Bye.
Bye.